I'm really excited. Thank you all for being here. I'm Sarah Milby, and I'm joined on stage by Julie, Eli, Sarah, and John. Thank you all for being with us for the conversation. We're going to be talking about the outlook on the U.S. election and what impact it might have on the regulatory space in crypto and real-world assets in particular. And it's funny, we were doing a prep call for this panel, and by the end of the prep call, we kind of looked at each other and realized that we were using the term RWA differently from one another. And I thought it might be kind of a fun exercise to kick us off, to kind of put on a regulator hat and pretend that we are writing legislation or a new rule, and how we might define real-world assets from that lens, because I think that's one of the hardest jobs that regulators have, is really trying to define our space and put rules and regulations in place. So to kick off the conversation, I don't know, Eli, if you want to give it a go.
I'll give it a go, yeah. So it's a great question, actually. What do we mean by RWA, or real-world assets? Obviously, this has changed. It's changed quite a bit, even in the 3 years that I've been in this space. I think that when we started, a real-world asset was often something which was very physical. It had to be something it was like real estate or something with a very fixed value in the not off-chain markets. And now it's kind of evolved to almost anything that is on-chain that has a link to something off-chain. A lot of now people think of public securities like treasuries or equities or different types of funds that have been tokenized as real-world assets, even though, us lawyers, we know that dematerialized securities are not anything more like the real world than the tokens themselves. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, but I think in the space what we think about is something which has been tokenized, something which is an off-chain asset of some kind or another, which is now appearing in on-chain and tokenized form. Let's call it that.
I think that's a pretty good definition. And Sarah, as a lawyer in this space, you wrestle with definitions all the time. So I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges you're facing and what you think the regulatory headwinds are? If it's more enforcement right now, if you're seeing more flexibility from some regulators, what do you think the outlook is?
That's a very interesting question, as we are 2 weeks until the election, and I know a lot of people in the space are very much focused on the election result. I think no matter what the result is, both in terms of president and Congress, we are all looking forward to have a more clear framework by having a U.S. legislation in a bill being passed in the space. What is lacking right now, and what we hope is, like any legislation, any bill can clearly define what is a crypto asset security versus not a security, and give CFTC the jurisdiction to regulate spot market and in addition to derivatives market. And if there are if we see needs of consumer protection, there can be disclosure framework and various agencies working together to regulate the market, versus right now there's no clear rules or frameworks for market participants to really participate and know what to do with the under the existing regulations. In terms of enforcement actions, we are all hoping to see more reasonable and less aggressive regulatory enforcement actions. That's something I think a lot of our clients and market participants are asking for and hoping for, and something may change in a few weeks. We will see.
And Julie, the regulators they're not always in lockstep with Congress and who we elect.
No, they're not.
So I'm curious how you think the upcoming election might play out and what that means for the regulatory space, both in the House and Senate and the White House, but also what that means at the regulatory level.
Yeah, sure. So we are 2 weeks out from the election, and I think it's important to take stock in what has happened this Congress. It was pretty historic in that the House passed a major piece of legislation addressing the market structure for digital assets, and they did it in a very bipartisan way. So you had 71 Democrats voting for this market structure bill in the House earlier this year. So we're starting from a good place, and when you look at the election and we look forward to the next Congress, this is going to be the most pro-crypto Congress that we've ever had, because of the work that's going on right now on the political side. So folks have probably been paying attention to the money that's being poured into into these races, Democrats and Republicans running for the House and the Senate. So again, it's a bipartisan effort. But what this translates to on the policy side is you have education efforts underway while these candidates are running before they even get to Congress. So in addition to having built allies this year who were in Congress and are likely returning, you have a new crop of members who will likely participate in the conversation and assist on trying to get this legislation passed in both in the House and the Senate. And we saw the benefits of this. It didn't get as much attention, I'd say, last cycle, but you had key freshman members who were assigned or who took positions with the House Financial Services Committee, the House Ag Committee, who were pivotal votes on both the stablecoin bill that went through the House and also the market structure bill that went through the House, and really strong allies when it came to peer-to-peer, member-to-member education. On the presidential, I think again, we'll be in a better position than we are right now. And I think former President Trump has made his position known, and we're eager to see what happens. But I also think Vice President Harris has taken a more, a different approach from President Biden to the extent that she can right now. I think she's in kind of a tough spot. So the signals are there, but we'll have to see what that translates to and how that impacts the SEC, I think is something that folks are watching as well.
And one of the interesting things, I think, is the way that Congress has reacted to the collapse of FTX. Like, I think that's been a big impetus for a lot of legislation that's come forward. Even if now people don't talk about it as much, I think it still lingers in the back of people's minds. And John, as someone in the custody space, I'm curious what kind of regulatory wins you're facing right now? Like, what's been a blockade for you? What's actually helped you? Where are you finding difficulty?
Yeah, so listen, first of all, just to echo what Julie was saying, I mean, our house view at Fireblocks is that there's really, no matter what happens in this election, who wins the presidency, there's going to be significant change on the regulatory front, including enforcement, as Sarah was talking about. And, Julie mentioned a couple bills that have gone through Congress, the stablecoin bill that made it out of committee, the market structure bill that also passed the House. But there was an additional bill that really is sort of esoteric but historic in its significance because it passed both houses, both the House and the Senate, with bipartisan support, and that was the repeal of SAB 121, which I still remember when this was issued. It's a rule out of the SEC, a sort of esoteric matter of how custodians need to account for digital assets, and makes it, short version is, makes it very difficult to serve as a custodian because if you're a public company, you have to put assets that you're custodying for others on your own balance sheet. That includes if you're a bank. So most people in this room probably immediately understand the implications of that. It's prohibitively expensive, if not impossible, to be a custodian, and has all sorts of perverse impacts, including a concentration of the number of custodians who really are willing to operate in this space. As I say, that was, that repeal of that rule, again, an esoteric matter, caught the attention of Congress, passed both houses, unfortunately was vetoed by President Biden. I think it's very likely that, if I sort of had to put money on the first legislative thing that would happen in the next Congress, it's probably a stablecoin bill and the repeal of that law, or if it's not, repealed, maybe even a withdrawal by the new commissioner of the SEC, whoever that ends up being. But hugely problematic, and it's proven to be both bad policy and bad politics. I think it really needs to go.
Can I add something about the SAB 121? So that veto threat was issued before there was ever the vote was taken in the House or the Senate. And I think this is a signal of the shifting political tides around digital assets. Because despite that, you had more than a handful of Democrats voting against the administration to repeal this because it was a bipartisan bill. And then when it moved over to the Senate, 20% of the Senate caucus, Democratic caucus, voted in favor of this repeal, including Majority Leader Schumer. So it's pretty significant that you have leadership voting against the administration. It's not often that you see that, so I agree with you, the chances of that passing are solid.
I think it's a very good point, and there's actually an argument to be made that if President Biden had not threatened that veto before the bill
Right.
passed, he wouldn't have vetoed it. Unfortunately, as a president, once you say you're going to do something, you say, if this comes to my desk, I'm going to veto it, you have to do that, right? Otherwise, you lose credibility. So very good chance that the next president, whoever that is, would sign such a bill.
With the bipartisan votes, would you say that crypto is a bipartisan topic when it comes to legislation in the House generally, or do you see one party leaning into it a little more favorably than the other, or a little bit more open-mindedness?
I think it is bipartisan. I think it's tougher for Democrats sometimes to lean in, because it's particularly in the Senate, because you have members in their caucus that tend to be the loudest, and there's not an elegant way for them to constructively work with, I'd say, the industry on legislation. But you're seeing we've seen champions in Senator Gillibrand and others who have been outspoken and strong champions. So it is definitely bipartisan, and we're seeing the increase, I'd say, of Dems are starting to balance out what might have been perceived as a bias towards Republicans.
I would also just add to that, you mentioned before, Sarah, FTX. I remember going down to DC a bunch in the spring of 2022, not only before FTX, but before the collapse of Terra Luna and, the subsequent implosions of a bunch of crypto companies that happened that summer. At that time, I came back and told everybody at Fireblocks, crypto is a bipartisan issue. Democrats, Republicans, everybody wants to make progress on this. They may have different reasons for that and different things they want to do, but it really is a bipartisan issue. FTX, in my review, really changed that, at least for a period. I think it's coming back, like you say, Julie, but unfortunately, I always thought that, why should crypto be a partisan issue at all? And it has become that. I'm hoping we're going to move away from that.
Yeah, there's definitely Democratic members who have taken it, on board and are real voices in the Richie Torres. There's a number of key Democrats who are really on board with this, and I think it's kind of more member to member than party. And certainly, if there's a Republican administration, I'm sure the Democrats will have different views about how the Republican administration is handling crypto as well.
Yeah, just to add on to FTX, I think. Honestly, it should not be a crypto issue. FTX, the collapse of FTX, is just a pure fraud that is already covered under criminal statute. It's something that should be punished and not something caused by lack of regulation in the crypto space. I think this is something people are sometimes do forget. It's just, unfortunately, a lot of times politics play a big role here, that making this a crypto issue, but rather I would say there are existing law and things that cover this in any way, and we are now trying to fill the gaps that what current law, current framework does not cover by proposing the new legislation.
And if you look at the legislation, it actually, you can tick through all of the concerns and reservations that opponents, you can qualify them as opponents, in the Senate have with crypto: consumer protection, investor protection, conflicts of interest. Fit 21, the market structure bill in the House, the commodity digital, or the bill that's coming out of the Senate Ag, or that's been worked on in Senate Ag, all address those consumer protections. And so there's not a reason, actually, that Democrats shouldn't lean in on this, because it creates investor protections and consumer protections for people operating in the space. And frankly, folks in the industry have been begging for this clarity and this regulation.
And Eli, tokenization is so new that I feel like education is one of the biggest parts of our job when we go into Congress. And I'm curious if you think that despite it being not extremely partisan as a topic, are there generational divides in terms of the way that people approach crypto and understand the blockchain technology that powers it? And how are you thinking about education as you go through building out your business?
I think the tokenization space itself is a little bit different than the rest of crypto. I think there's probably much more of an age gap in meme coins and NFTs and other types of crypto assets. I think the tokenization space, because of its strong link to traditional finance and so many traditional financial players in the industry doing the tokenization, and people who used to work in TradFi, so I think there's much less of an age gap I find in the RWA space than in other parts of crypto. So I think from an education standpoint, it's also a lot easier to understand, at least if you understand TradFi, it's a lot easier to understand because the concepts are pretty similar in most ways. There are some parts of the tokenization process which are new, which are different, of course, than you find in TradFi, and the education that you need to do in terms of the types of wallets, the types of custodians, the different chains that people use. That's important. That's certainly important in the discussions we have with the TradFi players. I think what we see in tokenization and RWA, because what we're dealing with aren't things that are outside of existing regulatory structures, that a lot of the work we have to do is education. And it's education to convince traditional financial players that they can operate in this space safely. And there's been an enormous amount of traction. I think 2-3 years ago, you found very, very few TradFi players that would have anything to do with tokens or chains or anything on chain. And now we have, BlackRock in the space. I mean, just you can see today who are on the panels, how many big, traditional financial players there are.
And with so much TradFi, Sarah, I'm curious, there are so many parallels in our space in the taxonomy that we use to describe different products or different phenomena that really, I think, echoes what happens in traditional finance. And I'm curious how the legal space is dealing with that as it coincides with existing law and how you as a lawyer are thinking about providing legal advice to your clients or the courts, like how are judges thinking about the space as it relates to and has parallels with traditional finance?
Yeah, definitely. I think you mentioned talk about education. I think that's the education is really two-way. One is educating the existing TradFi clients about what is blockchain enables and why there are risk mitigants we can help them put in place to address their concerns. It's about settlement, about transparency. I understand why they can see there are uncertainty around this technology, but at the same time, what are the ways that we have tools to help them address these issues? For the technology developers, and we need to help them understand that for a lot of tokenized securities, there are actually existing securities law applicable to these activities. So you do need to follow those rules, right? If you are acknowledged, you are opting into securities law framework, you can only be traded on ATSs or National Securities Exchange. There are rules around being a qualified custodian. There are rules around secondary transactions of restricted securities. So there are just a lot of things people, when they're thinking about tokens, they don't immediately see, okay, there are actually, if now I'm actually tokenizing securities, these rules do apply. So for us as a lawyer, the education is really two-way to fill in the gap. And also the challenge and the interesting part is how do we match the legal documents and the actual smart contract codes to make sure they're aligned? Like what we say is happening in legal documents, it's actually what's going on and happening in the blockchain side, right? So the matching is the challenging part, but I think a lot of people are looking into it and we're all hoping to achieve a perfect match.
And John and Julie, I'm curious what both of you all think is the biggest educational hurdle that we're facing right now.
Well, listen, I'll sort of maybe try to hit an angle that I don't think has been touched so far is education of regulators. So I think one thing that we find we spend, even as a software provider, we spend a lot of time going around the world meeting with regulators, and we find that the ones who take the best approach, and by that I don't just mean most business friendly, but the one that results in adoption and a robust market in that country, end up being the ones that are the most sophisticated on the technology. Sometimes that means having in-house people who are experts, but more often than not, it means leaning on industry, right? Which really just means, at least at Fireblocks, and I think this is true for many companies in the space, we're very happy to spend time, meeting with regulators to, educate them on the technology. The ones who take us up on that, Fireblocks and the industry, I think are the ones that end up with the best solutions. So a little bit, give and take on both sides, right? There's a responsibility on industry, but I think also on the regulatory side to, seek out that engagement.
Yeah, I think Regulators have a tough job because they're not there to promote a specific firm, and they're there to be technology neutral, but there has to be an understanding of the technology. And I think what we've seen with some of the legislation that's been introduced in Congress is it's clear the minute you read it that there's a lack of understanding of the tech. And that's not meant to be a slight. Regulators and policymakers have a host of things that they have to care about, and digital assets is probably a sliver of that. But what the legislation that I think works is when you've had an ongoing dialogue to bridge that technology knowledge deficit, and the end product is actually something that you can apply. Because I think what we've seen in some legislation is something looks good on paper, you understand the intent, but then when it comes to practically applying it, there's no way it's gonna work. And had they had those front-end conversations with someone familiar with the tech, and I feel like folks in industry, to John's point, we're willing to go in and be a resource, and it's not adversarial because we all want to fight bad actors, we want to protect consumers. We're not on the opposite side of that, we're on the same side. So bridging that technological deficit and then creating a solution that is you can actually apply and meets the intent of the regulator is tough, but there are pieces of legislation that have gone through that process, and I think those are the best ones.
Sorry, one more thing on the education side. I think, as Sarah said, it goes both ways because there's the traditional financial players who need to understand the technology, but there's also a lot of people in the DeFi space who need to understand how to do risk management and how to do proper legal assessment of investments that they are looking at. So I think that's also developed quite a lot in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, you didn't see very much real risk assessments of different types of RWA investments that the big DAOs and DeFi protocols were doing, and now you see much more of that. But there still needs to be further education, I think, in the DeFi space about what legal structures work and what legal structures don't work, what the regulatory risks are, what the investment risks are. And I think there's a number of people working on different aspects of that. The rating agencies will certainly help. Different types of players in the DeFi markets who help DAOs with their investments. That helps, obviously. So there's education going on both sides, and I think we will get somewhere in the middle, but we're not quite there yet.
Just to kind of take a slight turn, I'm curious what was the most pleasant surprise you all have had while working in the regulatory space. And I can give an example. I was at a speaker dinner earlier this year in London, and I ended up sitting next to a UK regulator, and he and I chatted for over an hour at dinner and had a really frank conversation about the anti-money laundering risks and the terrorist risk of digital assets and crypto. And I was shocked by how frank our discussion was. And it really made me question what was happening in the UK that I could bring to the US to try to facilitate that kind of dialogue better. And that was a really pleasant surprise for me. So if we just want to go down the line, I'm really curious, if there have been any pleasant surprises that you've had. Because I think it often feels like an uphill battle on the regulatory side. So maybe we'll find some sunshine too.
Sure, I'll start. So, listen, I actually think there are a lot of examples of this, and it's easy to forget them because there are so many, I'll call them, dark moments on the regulatory front the last few years. But maybe just to put a little bit of a spin on it, I'm going to call out here a particular regulator that I think has done a very nice job. MAS in Singapore, and in particular Project Guardian, in my view, is sort of the poster child for how regulators should go about approaching engagement with industry, but also cross-functionally, right? Cross-jurisdictionally with regulators in other countries. Their work with regulators in Japan and otherwise, I think has been very impressive and should be a model for how other regulators kind of think about setting those types of things up.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good example. I think we're all heard about how Singapore is taking the lead really in the fintech and digital asset space in being thoughtful about the regulation. I think another example would be in the EU, as we all know, MiCA, the markets in crypto asset regulation will be in effect by the end of this year. And it is controversial in the sense that there are all people, once it is enacted, people are saying, oh, this does not work, that does not work. There are a lot of people who have a lot of feedback. But I think it's a very, very good first step to actually do something about it, to set a framework. We can all debate whether what are the pros and cons, what are things, what are the gaps that can be filled. These are things worth discussing, but at least as a first initial step, they're doing something to put together a framework to allow market participants to try to comply and then give some certainty instead of on the other side of the ocean here, what we lack is certainty to let people work with the rules and to try to comply with the rules.
I mean, I think I've had more good experiences with regulators than not, although I have to say those have all been outside the United States. But apart from that, I mean, we've had very good discussions with Abu Dhabi Global Markets. They came to our RWA Summit in Dubai and spoke, and they were very open, very much wanting to learn, very willing to adapt the rules. We've had some very good discussions earlier on with the Thai SEC, who I think also really get the market well and have some good players in Thailand, who local players in Thailand who are really helping them out. And more recently, we've been working with a couple of partners in Australia, and we haven't had direct discussions with ASIC, but we know that the feedback that they've gotten for some of the things we've discussed have been very, very good and very, very positive. So I would say 3 off the top of my head.
I want to tease out Mika because I think one of the things that was a pleasant surprise was that they recognized that they didn't know enough yet about DeFi, and they said we're going to study it. We're not gonna rush to regulate, and so that was a pleasant surprise. But I think another question to tease this out a little bit more is, what happens when you don't have those good examples? And I think that's what we're experiencing in the U.S. And when you're in a firm like DCG with a mission of creating a decentralized world that unlocks economic and societal opportunity for these visionaries that we're investing in, this tech is boundaryless, so they have a choice of where they go. And so when we can list all of these great examples and the U.S. isn't one of them, what does that actually mean? It means that and we're actually seeing this, that these founders are choosing to go somewhere else. And I think that is a huge missed opportunity for the United States.
What do you guys think is the pain point that's causing the U.S. to be so hostile? Like, I'm just curious what you all are thinking might be some of the themes, like maybe broad themes of, is it we don't need to have a huge risk tolerance in our market. We have really strong capital markets. So crypto, because it's maybe like swept under the rugs, like we don't really need that here. Is that kind of the thinking behind some of the regulatory decisions? Is it political? What are you guys thinking?
I mean, I find it personality driven not to be very rude to Gary Gensler, but I was in the derivative space when he was in charge of the CFTC, and he had very poisonous relationships with all of the other regulators that he was supposed to work with. I think that he has a personality, a very prickly personality that people find very difficult. And for whatever reason, he's decided that this space is going to get him a lot of value going after people in this space. And he seems clearly, almost personally involved in some of these enforcement actions. And certainly when you hear him speak, which is not completely unnecessary, he doesn't have to go on Squawk Box all the time and say how bad the industry is. So it does feel to me that it is quite a bit personality driven, and when he's not there, it would be very helpful.
It's disproportionate too, given the remit of the SEC. Yeah. I'm surprised he spends so much time on it.
Do you think there are too many headlines that are directing Congress in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, definitely. Like, if you look at when these enforcement actions out of the SEC started to get announced and pursued, or when we got these negative statements from banking regulators, I mean, it was all really starting in January 2023, right? And it was caused by, very directly linked to at least FTX, right? So I do think it's political. We have, for better or for worse, in the U.S., an administrative setup where the enforcement division is very well funded. It is enabled, and my experience in talking both with regulators and policymakers in the U.S. is that, to your point, Sarah, it's not that they think there are exceptions to this, but by and large, they don't think that crypto should be offshore, or that it should not be in the U.S. I certainly don't think they're any more hostile than regulators in any number of other countries. But the enforcement capabilities of the agencies, and in particular the SEC, really set us apart. It's why you get advice as a crypto company looking, for example, to launch a token. Don't sell it in the U.S. It's not because the U.S. is the only place that you maybe can't do that. It's because the U.S. is the only place where you're going to very likely get sued by the SEC. So I think it's political. I think it'll change. I'm an optimist by nature, though. So.
I agree with that optimism. I think if I'm hoping that this next Congress builds on the progress that was made in the 118th, and if you look at the allies that we're likely to gain in the Senate and the House, and possibly the presidential, hopefully the discussion turns from enforcement to increased education so that decisions are made based on data, fact, and knowledge versus maybe speculation.
Yeah, just adding on to that, on the optimistic side, I think in a more reasonable SEC agency head, I think what we would see is like less aggressive or hostile enforcement action, also more engaging rulemaking process, interpretive guidances. I think in the last administration, there was a 2019 guidance, the DAO framework. There are various guidances and frameworks that was put out there, allow market participants to try to follow and give some guidance. We are only going after wrongdoings and illegal activities versus anyone. Let's say 2 weeks ago, Cumberland being sued was something very very upsetting for a lot of participants in the space.
And I think you see that pattern a lot of places, not just in the U.S., where the regulators tend to react to bad things happening. So other regulatory environments that are not as positive for crypto, like Canada, where they had the Quadriga crash, or Japan after MTGOX, it tends to happen that, if there's been a big negative event, that the regulators will have to react to it.
And we're close on time, so I'm going to move on to our last question, and we're going to take some bets and look into the crystal ball. Who do you guys think will win the U.S. presidential election? You can guess, or you can say 50-50. But I'm curious who you guys think, and then what do you think will be the biggest change as a result of that person winning, if you choose a person?
Boy, I don't know who's going to take the bait on who's going to win. I'm not. You can go to Polymarket for that. I think that the biggest difference, I talked earlier about all the various legislation that could go through, but I'll conclude where I just was speaking a minute ago, which is on the enforcement front. I think it's very likely that if President Trump wins, he'll come in and the agency, in particular in the SEC, is likely to review cases that have been filed and are before courts and decide whether there are any clear losers that should be dropped. May do also a review of rules that have been proposed but not finalized. So I think that's probably on the enforcement front is where you see the biggest change in my view.
Yeah, I think just following up on that, I think if we have a change of administration and a change of agency heads, I think a lot of, as far as we heard, there are quite a large number of outstanding subpoenas, voluntary requests from regulatory agencies that may be dropped or the agency may stop pursuing those requests, and maybe we can see some settlements just because the agency can be more reasonable on settling with those cases. And they can actually put time and energy onto going after the wrongdoers, actual illegal activities.
I won't predict who wins the election either, though I think it's a much closer than the Polymarket odds would indicate. But I will say I think there's going to be a lot of people disappointed in the crypto markets. There will be change. The tone will change, but the actual steps that the SEC may take will take some time, and there is not going to be a lot of patience in the crypto industry for time, and they will have to be a little bit more patient than people would like to be. So you'll probably see people disappointed and disillusioned by next summer that there hasn't been more obvious change as fast as they wanted to see it.
Given the context of this conversation, I think the biggest winner of this cycle is our space right now, digital assets, because we're going to have a more pro-crypto Congress in the 119th. we're going to likely have better relationships with whomever takes office. And I think that's a net positive already across the board, regardless of who wins the presidential.
I hate to keep everyone on their toes about who's going to win, but we'll have to wait 2 weeks. And thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.